in life for the symptoms that we have to treat. So our next speaker, I think we're going to be able to build upon some of the lessons that you heard from Dr. Relativity and touch on some of the aspects of how it impacts your brain and what we should do about that. So to introduce our next speaker, I'd like to welcome Paul DiLorenzo of KC Family Programs. And as I said, KC Family Programs is a key partner in our community of hope work. So please give Paul a warm welcome.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you for including KC Family Programs in this exciting event. For those of you who don't know us, KC Family Programs is based in Seattle, and it's the largest operating foundation in the country devoted solely to the improvement of the country's child welfare system. We have a presence in all 50 states, and our overall goal is to support states and local communities in their efforts to safely reduce the need for foster care. We believe that if we're able to engage families in the right interventions and levels of support at the right time, in the right amounts, they are more likely to be successful in caring for their children. KC Family Programs does this work in partnership with public and private agencies, schools, faith-based groups, and community and neighborhood residents all over the United States, with a clear understanding that no one entity can do this on their own. In doing this work, we've come to understand the importance of highlighting and applying the fresh and incredible findings of social and behavioral science to the task of strengthening families. For the past several years, our foundation has been influenced in large part by the implementation and the influence of evidence-based programming, and especially the research related to brain science, trauma, and adverse childhood experiences. The conversation and the information confirms in real terms what we've known for many years. The more toxic stress a family endures, the less likely it is they will be successful in raising the next generation of their offspring. But we're a foundation that believes in the possibilities, and as such, we've developed an initiative that we have called Building Communities of Hope. Hagerstown is one of those communities with whom we have agreed to collaborate, and it's been an exciting and very productive collaboration. The Sandmar Agency, along with many partners here, among them the schools, health clinics, the local Department of Social Services, the YMCA, just as some examples, as well as their very generous local supporter, the Fletcher Foundation, are doing something here that we believe holds great promise for the Bester community and for the city of Hagerstown as a whole. This event is really just one example of how smart innovation and strategically applied information will change the trajectory for the next generation of Hagerstown's children. So today I want to introduce my KC Family Programs colleague, Patsy Sellars. You have some information of her bio. Patsy is a managing director at KC Family Programs in our Child and Family Services division. But I want to just share a couple of personal notes. First of all, Patsy knows the work from the ground up, having begun her career as a frontline social worker. She currently manages a great deal of our direct service operations at KC and has been a part of our leadership team that has brought this new brain science and the appreciation for impact of trauma on children to our whole staff and to the staff of other agencies all over the country. She also has been in the front of the Foundation's efforts to explore more effective ways to support parents and their children in their own communities. Patsy is an influential voice both internally and externally, and as an advocate for children, she's consistently demonstrated integrity and sincerity in her belief that things can always improve for families and that we can build communities of hope. Patsy?
So good morning, everyone. I'm going to be moving around just a little bit, and is that really obnoxious when I do that, the sound of it? Is it okay? Well, thank you, Paul, for that lovely introduction, and thank you, Dr. Fellini, for the information that you shared with us this morning. So I'm going to do a little building on that from the perspective of brain science. But to begin with, I want to reference Malcolm Gladwell's work in Outliers, 10,000 Hours for Mastery, which is all about repetition, repetition, repetition. That's what the 10,000 hours is all about. And what this does, this repetition, is it paves neural pathways in our brain. And so I really kind of want to note that this is Dr. Fellini's brain. It is a superhighway of ACEs information. He has spent his career really looking into and understanding the impacts of adverse childhood experiences on children and ultimately on adults and on the outcomes for their health. And so it's really with sincere and total gratitude that I'd really like to thank you for the work that you've done. Because I really believe it's changing the way that we look at the impact of childhood on everyone's adult lives, including all of us here. And your superintendent did a really lovely job this morning of introducing our time together that way. With my work in the child welfare field, I believe that it's helping for us to deliver the message that resilience is built, rather than being something that's innate in children. And I think in child welfare that's a really important thing, because if we believe that we can only move a child from an unsafe situation and put them in a safe situation and everything is fine, then we're really not understanding the impact of trauma and the brain. So this is my brain. This is my brain related to the ACEs information and my own neuronal connections, because I've not been immersed in understanding brain science and its impact for my entire career. I have spent my whole adult life working with children and families and being really aware of the impact of trauma, but to really connect the dots together with the brain science information and now with what ACEs is telling us is a very new thing for me. So one thing that I hope to get across to you all today is that you too can learn this stuff. You can form new neural pathways in your brain that really help you in the work that you're doing, both for you as an individual, for your families, for the work that you do with children, with folks in prison, with whatever the work that you do, and for your community as Vesper's community of hope. And that's really why we're all here today, to translate your knowledge and your unique contributions to strengthen and improve your community. One thing that I really love about the brain science connection is that it really just makes so much sense to me, and in part because I have this nerdy approach to being in the world, but because it really gives us information that, as a friend of mine's mother said, when we know better, we do better. And so I'm really hopeful that what you learn today, you'll be able to apply and do better in your work. And that's not to say that at any point in time you're not doing good enough, because I really firmly believe that at any given point in time, we are doing the best that we can. But when we learn more and we apply that information, we're able to increase the impact of what we're doing. So a little about me. I have a 3 on the ACEs survey. And I know that it wasn't by accident that I chose the profession of social work. So that whole thing about healer, heal thyself. And I really spent my adult life really kind of trying to understand the things that happened to me, the things that happened to my parents, and how that led to who we are in the world today. And it's the continual integration of that information and that knowledge that's shaped who I am. When our organization decided that we really wanted to begin the work with Dr. Bruce Perry of the Child Trauma Academy, I was really excited about that, because it was that opportunity to kind of understand myself better and understand my family better. I was really attracted to one term that he uses a lot, and that's the term of neuroarchaeology. I studied psychology in my undergrad, and I studied some anthropology, and then understanding the development of the brain and going back in to understand the development of a brain related to traumatic impact of childhood experience. That term just made so much sense to me. Another thing about me is that I grew up in Oklahoma, and I lived there until my mid-40s. And so in Oklahoma, I've had a couple of experiences of community trauma, one being tornadoes. So I've been in a couple of tornadoes, and I have experienced the community when huge tornadoes are encroaching upon us, watching the news. How many people have seen the movie Twister? So in that movie, there is a newscaster whose name is Gary England. And they brought him into that movie because he's retired now, but he was like the god of tornado weather forecasting. And I will never forget, there was a 1997 tornado in Oklahoma City where over 40 people died. And we were all stuck to the television knowing that this tornado was going through our community. And we've heard him before say, you need to get in the bathtub, you need to go in your basement. What he said that day, which I still get feelings about it, was if you are in the direct path of this tornado and you are not underground, you will not survive. And that truly was the case for a number of people. I also experienced community trauma in the form of the Oklahoma City bombing. I lived in Oklahoma City at that point in time. And the way that I actually joined Casey Family Programs was to do grief groups with kids in foster care that we were serving in the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing. We knew in our community that everyone lost their sense of safety that day. And for kids in foster care who are especially vulnerable, really lost a sense of safety that was in addition to the sense of safety that had been disrupted from their childhood experiences. So again, my task for you today is to do some translating about adverse childhood experiences and brain science. And I'm going to really rely a lot on what I've been learning from Bruce Perry and his program called the Neurosequential Model of Therapeutics. And neurosequential really being the sequential development of the brain. And so hopefully you'll be able to translate some of these things into your approach to creating a community of hope within Vesper. And I want to give you fair warning, I'm going to do a lot of repetition, because again, that's how we all learn. As Paul said, Casey Family Programs is really committed to supporting communities in their desire to create hope for families and children so that all kids have the love and nurturance and support and the best opportunity and the best chance to grow up safe, in strong families, surrounded by supportive communities. And that's actually the tagline of Casey Family Programs. And I really absolutely believe that what we learned in the ACEs study from the exploration of brain science and from many other applications of expanding knowledge, like in the field of exercise, there's a lot of things that are being learned between exercise and the brain that are really helpful. Occupational therapy, body work, so massage, obviously medicine, psychology, even looking at some of the things that the military is using for serving combat soldiers. Those are all things that you can bring together and learn and apply in your community of hope. So I'm going to show this little video for you. Alberta, Canada is a community or a province that has really committed to building a community that's based on understanding child development and brain science. And like you, and like the investment made by Bill Young and the Fletcher Foundation, that's how it began in Alberta, Canada. A foundation, philanthropy was at the table. It also started with a conference similar to this one. And the community really came together and believed that building what they wanted to do for the betterment of their children and the future really rested on the grounding of understanding the impact of brain development and how they all attended to that. So let's watch this brief video.
Science tells us that the experiences we have in the first years of our lives actually affect the physical architecture of the developing brain. This means that brains aren't just born, they're also built over time based on our experiences. Just as a house needs a sturdy foundation, foundation to support the walls and roof, a brain needs a good base to support all future development. Positive interactions between young children and their caregivers literally build the architecture of the developing brain. Building a sturdy foundation in the earliest years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental function and better overall health. So just how is a solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two. From eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions, repeated throughout a young person's developing years, are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development. But another kind of childhood experience shapes brain development too, and that's stress. Good kinds of stress, like meeting new people or studying for a test, are healthy for development because they prepare kids to cope with future challenges. Another kind of stress, called toxic stress, is bad for brain development. If a child is exposed to serious ongoing hardships like abuse and neglect, and he has no other caregiver in his life to provide support, the basic structures of his developing brain may be damaged. Without a sturdy foundation to properly support future development, he's at risk for a lifetime of health problems, development issues, even addiction. It's possible to fix some of the damage of toxic stress later on, but it's easier, more effective, and less expensive to build solid brain architecture in the first place. One of the things that sturdy brain architecture supports is the development of basic emotional and social skills, an important group of skills which scientists call executive function and self-regulation can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's mental airspace. Think of a young child's brain as the control tower at a busy airport. All those planes landing and taking off and all of the support systems on the ground simultaneously demand the controller's attention to avoid a crash. It's the same with a young child learning to pay attention, plan ahead and remember, and follow lots of rules. Like all of us, kids have to react to things happening in the world around them, while also dealing with worries, temptations, and obligations on their minds. As these demands for attention pile up, air traffic control helps a child regulate the flow of information, prioritize tasks, and above all, find ways to manage stress and avoid mental collisions along the way. Having this ability is a necessity for positive and level mental health. Developing effective air traffic control, overcoming toxic stress, and building solid brain architecture are things kids can't do on their own. And since strong societies are made up of healthy, control.
Isn't that an awesome video? So one of the really cool things about this video is that you can use it anywhere. It is an educational video that is on YouTube, or even better, go to the Alberta Family of Wellness website, and there's a lot of information, a lot of resources for how they've approached their work. The state of Wisconsin has also engaged in using brain science information to really look at how the state, and it's led by their First Lady, how they can really improve the lives of kids by attending to brain development. So that's another place to go. And just as a heads up, one of the things that you're going to receive when you return to your daily lives after today is a resource list via email. And that resource list has lots of different connections in it that hopefully will be live when you receive it. And you can just do a lot of navigating in the world of child development, children, brain science, protective factors for families, the Harvard Center for Child Development, all those kinds of things are on that. And hopefully you'll find it a really useful resource. So for the next hour and a half, again, I'm going to talk about brain science. And I'm going to talk about the processes in the development of the brain. I'm going to talk about how memories are created. I'm going to talk about the arousal continuum, which has two components, one being the arousal part and then a dissociative part. And I'm going to talk about the importance of connections and relationships. And then I'm going to close a little bit understanding reward and pleasure. And I think what you heard about coping behaviors from Dr. Filippi's work, it'll make a lot of sense when we talk about the reward and pleasure part of brain development. And throughout, I'm going to keep trying to make connections to ACEs incorporating this information in your community of hope. So for the evolution of our brain, we really came about growing together in small groups of about 20 people, and the ratio of children to adults in that community was 1 child to about 4 adults. Today, to find that kind of ratio in a school system, in a child development center, that's not very likely. And so what children received and how our brains grew was through significant relational input and many adults attending to and paying attention to us. A lot of that had to do with protection too, and so the development of the arousal continuum in our brain had a lot to do with protecting us from threat. And that threat often came in the form of other humans, and so being able to recognize and determine if a human was a threat or a friend to you was really important in the evolution of our brains. Before we get started though, you know, when you are sitting for a long time in the morning, listening to information from talking heads, you tend to do what the human brain also does, and that is tune out a little bit, or daydream, or, you know, do your shopping list. And one of the things that I'm going to incorporate into the talk, so every 20 minutes, we're going to take a minute, and we're going to do a brain break. And it is time to do our first brain break. And I understand from Christy, I had an email exchange, and she let me know that Bester teachers actually use brain breaks in their classroom. And it's a really great way to kind of take a minute, refocus, get your blood flowing, because when your blood flowing, you have better connections happening in your brain. So let's all do that. If everybody could stand up. So, our first brain break is a pretty simple one until you speed it up a little bit, and I'm not that great at it because you're doing 2 different things. The first thing you're doing is touching your nose and bringing your arm around and grasping your ear. So it's a touch, grasp. And then you bring your arms down, and you do the same thing on the other side. Touch, grasp. And so just swing again, touch, grasp. Swing again, touch, grasp. Swing again, and hopefully what you're doing is you're bringing the other arm to the top each time. So touch, grasp, touch, grasp, touch, grasp. Elbow windmills coming up, and to clap, clap, miss clap. So we'll do those. And I'm going to go ahead and set my trusty timer for 20 minutes. And we'll do another brain break in 20 minutes. So let's talk a little bit about the development of the brain. There's a really awesome book, and if you have not read it, particularly those of you who are parents or teachers, I strongly recommend it. And it is The Magic Trees of the Mind, How to Nurture Your Child's Intelligence, Creativity, and Healthy Emotions from Birth Through Adolescence by Marian Diamond and Janet Hobson. And it really is a lovely book that just kind of lays out for parents and for people who work with kids the development of the brain and key points that are really important to attend to. But I'm going to use her analogy of magic trees as I talk with you about the development of the brain. So let's imagine this part of the tree right here, that's the nerve cell. This part coming down from the tree is the axon that extends away and carries messages away from the nerve cell. The branches are the dendrites. The dendrites are what receives information in from other axons in the brain's environment, or in the body's environment. And these leaves, you can call them spines on the dendrites. They are really the receptors along the dendrites that really connect together. So there are some other brain development terms that I think are really important and that I'll make some connections to later on. But before I go to that, I just want to make note that when you were doing the exercise, the brain break, there were 1 billion times a second neuronal chemical transmissions happening in your brain. Just stop and think about that for a minute. That is really amazing. The work of the human brain is just, that's why I love it so much. It's just ridiculous. So some more brain development terms. Neurogenesis is the birth of new neurons. And so I'm going to talk a minute about plasticity too. The birth of new neurons means that we can change our brains as we go through life, which is really important because for a long time people thought our brains grew and that was it. And then it was just a decline into old age. And I know that recently I've paid attention to my own brain health. I haven't done Sudoku puzzles like I read an article that said just do Sudoku, you'll be fine. So somebody raise a hand who does Sudoku. But really paying attention to other things that I can do that are new things that I learned that expand that. Migration is an important term, and that is when nerve cells move from one part of the brain to the other to really specialize and differentiate. Differentiation is the changing of one cell type to another. So for example, a brain cell that moves from being perhaps a motor at the beginning to more specialized, like a vision brain cell. Apoptosis, I love that word for some reason. I actually woke up in the middle of the night thinking, apoptosis. What that is cell death, or when cells who are no longer being utilized are resorbed into the body system. Arborization, another tree analogy. Arborization is the expansion of dendritic connections. Synaptogenesis. That's, every time you hear genesis, you know it's birth. So synaptogenesis is the birth of new synaptic connections. And then what happens, kind of similar to apoptosis, is synaptic sculpting. And sculpting is when you're kind of taking away connections that aren't being used anymore. And so it's a reduction in synaptic connections. And then another one of my favorites that I'm going to close this part on is myelination. Myelination, when axons have lots of firings, it's a fatty substance, a fatty white substance that actually the myelin goes on. Have you guys heard myelin sheath? I mean, there's different things that I think we've heard throughout our years. But myelination, to me, is what creates the superhighways that these things can travel on really quickly. So there's a quote by Dr. Diamond that I really like too, and it is that the brain is a highly dynamic organ that feeds on stimulation and experience and responds with the flourishing of branching, intertwined neural forests. Now, if that doesn't make you want to read her book, I don't know what does. So let's talk a little bit, and again, a lot of the slides that I'm going to use are slides from Bruce Perry with the Child Trauma Academy. This is really his life's work. As my little bio said, I am in phase 2. So again, I'm really just learning this information, but phase 2 of the neurosequential model of therapeutics. Jerry, who's going to speak to you after lunch, is one of the fellows, so he is another one with the superhighway brain about the neurosequential model of therapeutics and really understanding brain science. But let's just take a look at this little image of the brain. One thing that's very important to know is that the brain develops from the bottom up and from the inside out. And there are 4 primary regions of the brain that we'll focus on in our conversations today. The brainstem at the very base of the brain, the diencephalon, the limbic system, which is the house of our emotional work, and then our neocortex, which is the outer surface of our brain. And another tree analogy that's kind of fun that I learned fairly recently is that the word cortex actually means bark. So like the bark of the tree, and your cortex actually covers your entire brain. As you can see here, oops, I keep pushing the wrong thing. These are the functions of the brain in relation to what we're looking at here. And so when a child is born, their brainstem is pretty much developed, because without that, without the ability to access things like kind of like the stabilizing functions of life through the central nervous system, they wouldn't be able to survive outside the womb. And then as you go up, the development happens in sequence, obviously neurosequential, and again inside out. And the organization of the upper parts of the brain are very dependent upon the organization of the lower parts of the brain. I mentioned the word plasticity before, the ability of the brain to grow and change over time. And what's important about this one to remember is that, yay, plasticity. But the one thing that is not true is with the increased complexity of the brain, that increases the plasticity. So I'm not doing well with this. So the brainstem area, as I was talking when children are born, it's pretty well said, the plasticity of the lower parts of the brain is not nearly what it is in the upper parts of the brain and the cortex. So learning a new language, that doesn't happen in the brainstem, that happens in the cortex. And so our ability to change and grow, again, is dependent upon that region of the brain. What's important to note, though, and I think Jerry may talk about this a little bit, is that when you understand, again, neuroarchaeological terminology, when you understand insults that happen in this period of the brain, there are things that can happen, repetition, 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 that can begin to reorganize those parts of the brain that then lay the foundation for upper parts of the brain. And one thing that's also important to note is that when there is some dysfunction in the lower part of the brain, it actually impacts what's happening in the upper part of the brain as well. Some more key concepts in neurodevelopment. Nature and nurture, we've all heard that. It is nature and nurture. I remember when I was growing up, it was the big debate, nature or nurture, which was more important. Sequential neurodevelopment. Sorry. I should have somebody else operate this because I'm clearly not skilled at it. Huh? Yeah, I can do that, but I can't do. So sequential neurodevelopment, I was talking about that a little bit, that the brain grows bottom up, inside out. I'm actually going to ask you, I'm going to stand at the back of the room, and I'm going to ask you, how does the brain grow? And you can't get out unless you tell me. Bottom up, inside out. Biological relativity is another term, and that is that any event or experience is greatest and most actively changing or dynamic during that window of development time. So the power of any experience really impacts development based on what's happening within the brain and the developing times. Use dependent, I'm going to talk about that a lot as I continue. Use dependent is really that whole idea of use it or lose it. And as I talked before about brain development, so apoptosis, synaptic sculpting, that really has to do when the brain is not being used, it begins to shrink. And so the brain image that Dr. Felitti shared of a 3-year-old boy with neglect, deprivation, and really key times, windows of opportunity for brain development or hot zones of development can leave huge gaps in brain development as well. So we have to be stimulated. We have to have experience that forms those connections that lays the organization for the brain to operate effectively. And all of that is why we ask the question when we talk about trauma-sensitive practice, not what is wrong with you, but what happened to you. And understanding that the experiences is related to the behavior that we're seeing today or the challenges that we're encountering with young people that we serve. A little bit about memory. To understand memory is to understand development, and there are some key factors about memory that are, again, built on some of the brain science principles that I've talked about. We take in information, and that information is taken in, external information is always taken in from the brainstem first. And if we have challenges in our brainstem, then that information coming in is impacted by some of those developmental insults or gaps that we have. So sensory information coming in, and then If it's novel, new information, we actually have a little bit of an arousal or alarm response to that because we're trying to make sense of it. If it's information that we've seen before or are familiar with, then it's matched to templates that we have and associations are made, and we kind of pair that. So every experience that you have is not coded in your brain as a unique and distinct memory. It is really based on, did this happen before? Was it a scary situation? It wasn't, so I'm just going to say, oh, that's part of this, and I'll move on. So many of you are teachers. When you're in your classroom, everything's kind of going on the same. Everything's good. But say something really unusual happens, you begin to pay better attention to that or more attention to that because it's a new situation and your brain is really paying close attention to that. Our brain is also very, very interested in maintaining homeostasis. And homeostasis is steady state or equilibrium. And again, alarm, is everything okay? And then kind of go back down. When children are developing in the uterus, that is really like the safest place we'll ever be. In our mother's womb, hopefully, in our mother's womb where everything's taken care of for us. And we have exposure to a primary stimulus, and that primary stimulus is our mother's heart rate at about 60 to 80 beats per minute and multiples thereof. That's really important because that sets a stage for the repetition, rhythmic information that organizes the lower part of our brain so that when we come out, we're able to live on our own. And memory is also way more than conscious images. It's stored in our tissues. Neurons are not only in the brain, they're throughout our whole central nervous system. And there's a really great book called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk that talks a whole lot about what the impact of body memories are and how treatment can actually happen from there. And so I have a story that I want to share with you that's kind of about, well, it's totally about myself. And something that I really learned recently that put to rest, I think something that I've always had a question about. When I was in social work school, one of my professors talked about lacuna, which is fabric with a hole in it. And she really taught us that as social workers, one of the things that we really want to do are weave together the threads to make the cloth whole again. And I had this experience when I was in high school that I've always felt like is this hole that I couldn't really understand. I, from early childhood on, I think, I'm one of 6 kids, and I've been the kid in the family that responded well in a crisis. If one of my siblings was beating up on the other one, I was in there to kind of mediate what was going on. In high school, there are a couple of things that happened too that led me to believe it wasn't just that window of time. And then, through my adult life, I'm like the person you come to in the form of crisis. But I had this experience in high school where I basically became incapacitated. So I was coming home after being out with a couple of friends of mine, and we came upon a wreck. And we were driving down the street, and we noticed there was a car wrapped around a tree. And we thought, holy crap, and right as we came upon that, a car pulled out in front of us and took off. And, it was a hit and run, obviously. So we chased that car down, we got the license plate, and then we went back. And we were like, we were the first responders, so we wanted to see if this woman was okay. And I was fine chasing the car down, getting the license plate. As soon as I heard that woman begin to wail, something happened to me. And I really didn't understand it, but I seriously became incapacitated. I could not get out of the car. I kind of curled up in a fetal position. And I thought that was the weirdest thing because that was so unlike me. And I was just like, okay, well, that was one thing. But I've held it in my head all along. So I was listening to this book, The Body Keeps the Score, as I was driving and really beginning to think about what's stored in our brains, the information that is really kind of pre-verbal and inaccessible. It does stay with us. I remembered when I was listening to this that my mother told me, and it was through a medical visit, she was actually responding to the doctor, that she was in a very serious car wreck when she was 8 months pregnant with me. And I thought, wow, I think there's a connection here. So I called my mother and I talked to her about that. And indeed, she was in a very serious accident when she was 8 months pregnant with me. She was actually thrown from the vehicle and cried and wailed. And I thought, holy crap, that's it. You know, it was like I had this memory in my body that I had no access to, that information really pulled in. And I just tell you that story because I think it's so, for me, it's very profound about the impact of things in our lives and how they stay with us, even though we cannot maybe consciously access them. I talked a little bit about templates before. I'm going to check this because I don't know if it's on. Okay, we have 2 minutes till our next brain break. So templates, again, I talked about information being stored in the form of templates, and new information coming in is matched against those templates. And that's really what happened to me in that car wreck, was the wailing was matched against a previous template stored in my body that led me to kind of regress in my response to that. So let's talk a little bit about information coming in from the lower part of our brain to the higher part of our brain. So this is a stimulus that happens, and again, as I said before, external stimulus comes in through the brainstem because it's where our 5 senses come into our bodies. So it enters here and it goes into the brainstem, and it may be something that's information that's immediately responded to. Like if you touch a hot pan on the stove, if it took the time for that pan to go all the way up into your cortex and then back out for you to respond, you might have a worse burn than if your body just immediately reacted to that. And so information coming in also may go up into your diencephalon and be processed there. It may go up into your limbic system, ultimately into your cortex, where you have the ability to apply abstract thought or your higher thinking powers, and you can make a judgment or a decision about information, and then it comes out to a response. So multi-system, multi-level processing really, again, is connected to the development, bottom up, inside out. And our responses are also dependent upon the organization of these areas, especially if it's the input is going all the way up to our cortex. How many of you have driven to work and you're daydreaming, and then you go, I don't remember that last 10 minutes of driving? How many people have done that? So that is memory in action too, because again, as I was saying before, that's that experience of, you know, this is a normal thing matched against the template, and so your body is able to deal with that at the motor level, and you're keeping an eye out for novelty, but you're not totally focusing on it. But what happens if you're in that state, you're driving along, you're kind of daydreaming, like I said before, you're making your grocery list, and you hear, oop, time out. You hear a siren, and then boom, you come to attention. You know, like, is that a police officer after me? Am I going to get a ticket? Or is that, do I need to go all the way? And so then you remember what's happening. So just remember that as a good example of memory and novelty and how we pay attention and how we can tune things out. Okay, next brain break. Ready? This one might be a little tougher, I don't know. Or it might be easy, especially if you've done it before. So this one I call the Elbow Windmill. And I did this as a kid, and I don't know if it's really a brain break, but it's like an official brain break if you go to the website, the blog spot. But it's one that I love to do. And what you do is you bring your elbows together, and you swing them, and then you swing them back out. And then you bring them together again, and you swing them, and you swing them back out. And every time you do it, you speed it up. And what gets even more fun is you switch your arms about which one is in front. Oh, leave your ball in there.
And then unplug it. Yeah, that's a good idea.
So this slide really talks about traumatic events, often leading to prolonged alarm reactions that then change the systems in our brain. But to begin with, I want to just note that not every traumatic event is experienced by every person in the same way. Like you could be one of multiple siblings in a family and something happens, and your experience of that and your siblings' experience of that could be very different. I have another little story of my own, and what I really believe is a prolonged alarm reaction. So I live in Washington State, and I have an apartment in Seattle, and then I have a home on the other side of the Cascade Mountains. And so I have to drive over the mountains frequently. And there's this one road that's a beautiful, beautiful road that is closed every winter because of the amount of snow on that road. There's no way they could keep it open. And I drive a Jeep Wrangler intentionally, and so, you know, normally snow driving, no big deal. Well, this one time I drove over in October, and I took the high road, which was still open, and a friend of mine said, there's a snow forecast. No worries, I can drive the snow. Well, I wish goodness I had never taken that road that night, because what happened was, as I was approaching the most desolate, isolated part of this road, because you can imagine it's closed all winter, so people don't live there. It's part of the North Cascades National Park. Snow started coming, and my first response was, isn't that beautiful? I love snow. Kind of like when Bob was driving us from the airport yesterday. Look at that beautiful snow. Vince can tell his grandchildren he saw snow. Well, this snow was not that kind of snow. It got heavier and heavier and heavier, and it was getting darker and darker and darker, and I was what it felt like to me the only person on that road. Well, the snow quickly accumulated, very thickly. I no longer could tell where the road was. I was driving on the middle part of the road because it had the indentions in it so that I knew I wasn't going to drive off the highway. And there are drop-offs on that highway. And I also knew that this road closes every winter. What if this is the winter storm that closes this road and I go off and nobody knows where I am because it's snowing so heavily? And I totally was freaked out. And I was freaked out for an hour and a half. And now, when I try to drive over the mountains, not try because I do, anytime snowflakes come down, when I'm approaching the pass, I freak out. My body freaks out. And it's more than just like alert, paying attention. Like not incapacitated like the car accident, but I really have to calm myself down intentionally to get through that. So imagine you're the snowplow guy. He sees this all the time, no big deal. I'm out there cleaning up the road. His experience of that night and my experience of that night are two completely different things. But I would like you to know that the road did close that night for the whole season, which kind of justifies my feeling about being freaked out about driving. So that's an important thing to remember. Traumatic event for one person may not be the same experience, and if we are aroused and on alert for a prolonged period of time, there are changes that actually happen in our brains and in our bodies related to our arousal continuum. Just really quickly, I'm kind of aware of our time. I'm going to skip over a couple things. I want to talk with you just a minute about executive functioning. So I imagine all the teachers are really aware of executive functioning. So I've talked a bit about the brain organizes from... Thank you, that's awesome. So here we see two brains that have organized from the bottom up and the inside out. This brain right here is someone who was well supported for their whole development. This brain is from a person who had some significant insults that really limited the growth and the connections made, the branching of the beautiful neural forests in their brain, in their limbic cortex area. And so when they are encountering a challenge, executive functioning is really the ability to use your cortex to think your way into regulating yourself. And you know, kids in school, you see this a lot, standing in line and, oh man, I just can't take this anymore, and so I hit the kid in front of me. Some of that's normal behavior of kids, but sometimes it's also a challenge because the ability to access the cortex to rein myself in and say, wow, if I whack this kid, then I'm going to have consequences and I'm probably going to have this happen to me. And so executive functioning is, I think, something that I want you to think about and pay attention to in relation to brain development. This is one of my favorite things that Bruce Perry has put together, and it's the Arousal Continuum. And I really love this because it makes so much sense to me. And I've talked as a part of my role in Casey with a number of folks. Paul had me come to Maryland. Where was I? Columbia, and met with child welfare leadership and really talked about the arousal continuum in relation to the organization and how they, as leaders, can attend to trying to stay in the calm state where you actually have access to the best part of your thinking that comes from your cortex. You can think of that in your school system too. Like if your school system gets tuned up, then what happens is you lose the ability to bring your smartest thinking to the table. And so let's go back to an individual. So a child growing up, you know, you have a memory that's matched, or you have an experience that's matched against a template that you have, or everything's okay, everything's fine. So you kind of stay in the calm area. But you have an experience that's like, whoa, nothing like this has ever happened to me. It sends you down the continuum to arousal, alarm. Maybe, you know, in the case of severe domestic violence, sexual abuse, it might send you all the way down to fear or terror. I mentioned before there's two ways of responding, and each person kind of develops their more preferred way of responding, either in the hyperarousal way or a dissociative way. But when you kind of follow that down, the relationship between your mental state, your ability to think, and then are you tuning out or are you tuning up? And it's all connected to the freeze, flight, fight connection too. One thing to remember for all of us too, especially since we're adults and many of the adults in this room, is power differential. When a person has power over another person because they're an adult and they're a child, or because I'm a boss and you're my employee, or because I'm a person of the majority, I'm a white person and you're a person of the minority, society gives me a little power, that the person in the position of power really has the responsibility to attend to the alarm state that they may be putting the other person in. And the way that we can attend to that is really paying attention to de-escalating behaviors that we engage in. Because it's like that mirror thing that happens. There's mirror neurons about us paying attention. That's part of that serve and return that we saw in the Brain Builders video. The mother's face, the child's face, and how those connections go back and forth. And so if I am aware that I'm your boss and I'm getting ready to have a challenging conversation with you, or one that you're not feeling comfortable about, or I'm a teacher and you're a kid and you just pulled somebody's hair, if we escalate, we are escalating them. If we de-escalate, we're helping them find a place of calmness. And that can be done through our body language, through where we are, like getting down on a child's level. I know the teachers all know this. Being predictable, extending control. These are all really important things with that. I'm going to skip ahead of states become traits is a really important thing, a concept that's extremely important, I think has a lot to say about the ACEs study. That when we are in prolonged stress reactions and we have changes in our neuronal systems, a state, which is, I'm kind of freaked out right now, becomes a trait. And a way to pay attention to that is basal heart rate. A normal heart rate being about 50, 60, 70 beats per minute. And then when you're aroused, your heart rate really increases. I have to acknowledge when I was sitting there listening to Dr. Feliti, my heart rate was whacking out because I'm like, I have to follow him. And then, I try to use my executive functioning to calm myself, think myself into being okay. But if I am in that way for a long time, then my heart rate actually changes and moves up, and it becomes a trait. So I become tuned up on a regular basis. And that increase in all of those bodily functions, I believe, really is connected to the results of the study. One of the things that's important to know, too, is that kids who are tuned up, kids who act out, they're primarily seen in the mental health system. Kids who tune out, so dissociate, if you're in a situation where you are the person on the, like you're being sexually abused by a powerful adult figure, a way to escape that is by leaving. And people who develop dissociation as their primary way of dealing end up in the health system with lots of somatic complaints. So I'm going to skip ahead to another video that I want you all to see. This is another video. Dan Siegel, his work is widely across YouTube and across the internet. And this is a really easy, simple thing that you all can share with the young people with whom you work.
One of the most rewarding experiences for me has been that we have in the course of day-to-day life.
Pretty cool, huh? I taught that to my 7-year-old granddaughter, and she really loves it and uses it. And she tends to be a pretty fiery individual, so she flips her lid a lot. And it's really helpful to give us, and with her parents, to give some common language to help her figure out ways that work for her to regulate herself. Again, also available on YouTube. I've got a whole bunch of slides. I kind of pulled a Bruce Perry thing, so what he does, those of us who study with him or work with him, he has like 5 zillion slides, and he goes through and just picks out key ones. And I put in a ton of slides in this, and so I'm just going to hit a few others now because my time is running out, and I know you want to do your last brain break. But this one, and I think you guys might get the PowerPoints or something. I know Carrie has them. I just want to note that Bruce Perry's work is all copyrighted, and he's very intentional about people being able to speak to his work. And so if you get this PowerPoint, please know that you do not have permission to use them and speak to them, but that you can look at them for your own reference and to remember some of these conversations we had. This one is a really good one because it talks about the kinds of things that we do to help de-escalate, depending upon where a person may be in their arousal continuum, or what we do that actually can potentially trigger or escalate someone. This next slide I don't want to miss because it really is important, because relational health is what it's all about, and that is what you're focusing your community of hope on, is ensuring that kids and everyone in this community has the support that they need to achieve their core potential. And we all have, again, templates that are formed in our initial relationships with our mothers, our primary caregiver. And this one here and this one here, these are more what will happen to result in a neglect situation where a child is really not receiving the stimulation. This would be a depressed mom, and this would be a mom that's really in a chaotic environment where she's not really attending to the needs of her baby. And if a child is not getting the optimal, which we saw in the serve and return reactions, then that experience, that repetition that builds the brain, bottom up, inside out, is not happening either in gaps or happening in ways that's really, really confusing and creating that alarm arousal state for a prolonged time that changes the neural systems. So these are really the templates that we have for relationships going forward, and what we really want in our communities is to support families in having this kind of relationship consistently. One of the things that I heard Bruce say recently is mediocre consistency is better than serial goodness. And that being particularly kids who end up being removed from their homes, especially in those first 3 years of life, that consistency with someone who may go here a little while, but overall is paying attention and helping that child experience some love and connection is way more important than changing people, even if they're wonderful, loving people, because that really sets the template. Novelty, 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 that would just freak you out as an infant. I'm going to skip over. Let me see where I'm skipping to. I mentioned before reward and pleasure as something that's really important, I think, related to the ACEs study. And so the coping behaviors that we bring in, or the behaviors that we experience that really help soothe our brain and help regulate ourselves, make a difference. And that's I think it's noradrenaline, norepinephrine, and dopamine are the key neurotransmitters that help us either get more tuned up or help us become more calm. And the kinds of things that are helpful, music, rhythm, I talked about that with the mother's heart rate, that's kind of built into who we are, and rhythm is a very helpful thing to help us calm down. Sweet, fatty, salty foods, eating helps us calm down. Dr. Philly used the term comfort food. Positive human interactions, that template from our mothers. Sex, Dr. Philly mentioned that, acting out in sexual ways that are coping behaviors. The use of alcohol, the use of drugs. I think that thing about amphetamines being an early depression treatment is really amazing and very interesting. Cut, pick, full. I'm actually one of those people. I notice that when I get anxious, I start scratching my neck. And it's very soothing to me, but I end up with like red marks all over my neck. But anyway, this is an important thing to think of too, in terms of kids in your classroom, prisoners with whom you work, whatever their primary modes of calming themselves down. And what we want to do ultimately is get to the things that are healing and helpful. So let me see where I'm going now. This is another thing that I think is really important, and it's built along, bottom up, inside out, intentionally, that for us to be able to access the higher parts of our brain, we first have to be regulated. And attending to regulating those with whom we work, attending to regulating ourselves, then frees us up to have relationships and interactions with other people, which then really support the best functioning of our brain. I want to get to... Well, I like this one. I want to show you this one because this to me is like a picture of a community of hope that really has attended to developing brains. So the first, you have the mother with a primary impact being in the brainstem, and then the mother's support and relationship as it goes up through the cortex. Then come other caregivers, which is the yellow. Then come family and friends. So everybody has an impact, but the impacts increase. And in a community of hope, in schools, other people are really, really important for the development of a fully functioning brain that allows someone to achieve their core potential. And that really, to me, is really a picture of a fully functioning community of hope. So I want to get to one last video, but before we do that, I want to do the last brain break with you because it's a fun one. Okay, everybody stand up. See, you're creating memories for yourself, associations of being successful at something, and then you'll feel really good going out to lunch. So, this last video, I really want to show it, and I know we're running a little bit late, but I had hoped to get a snippet of the Paper Tigers movie for you, but in my exchanges with the Paper Tigers people, they didn't release until just last week, and I had already sent to Carrie my PowerPoint, the ability to purchase by streaming their clip of the movie so I could narrow it down. For those of you who've seen it, I really wanted to show the scene of the science teacher talking with the students about ACEs and just the looks on their faces when they're recognizing the impact of ACEs on their own lives. In my exchange with the producers of Paper Tigers, they said, well, here's this. And what this is the trailer for the new movie Resilience to be released next month. And it really, I think, lays an awesome foundation for us to close on for your community of hope.
We all like to think of childhood as this time of joy and innocence. But, I mean, for many of us, it's...
And it's on the Science of Hope that I want to remind you that you can continue to pave new neural pathways in your brain so that you end up getting smarter and smarter and create superhighways for the community of hope investors. Thank you all.
Guys, let's give Patsy another hand. That's great job. So just like with our other speakers, I want to give the opportunity to ask some questions. We have about 5 minutes, and then we're going to get ready to start lunch. So if folks have questions, you can meet me over here. I will say one thing that stood out with your snowflake story was yesterday as we were driving from the airport here, and we left BWI, and we were on 70, that snowflakes started falling. And I have a whole different memory now of your drive experience, that I thought you were just having a lovely drive. And meanwhile, you were in pain. Any questions for Patsy regarding her presentation? All right, we got 2-minute warning. 2-minute warning. As we get ready to welcome our next speaker, let's do a couple public service announcements here. At the end of Dr. Yager's presentation, you'll be able to pick up your CEU certificate of training, and we'll be giving those out at the back, the entrance that you came into today. You can pick up your certificates at the conclusion of today's presentation, okay? Also want to just thank a couple people who have been very helpful throughout the process here of putting this conference together. My right-hand partner, Carrie Fair, who many of you worked with to register for the event, and to really help with a lot of the behind-the-scenes. Carrie's here now. I'm pointing back there. Carrie's here. So if you guys could help me and applaud Carrie Fair for all her work today. Several others have put this together. We have a volunteer crew as well as some of our Sanmar staff. I apologize if I missed anybody, but we have a whole army of people. We have Jerica Washington, Alexa Castle, Patsy Price, Ted Morningstar, and we had a whole volunteer parking crew who you might have seen if you tried to pull into the school and you weren't a teacher. Sorry about that. But those, Mr. McCarney is actually one of our foster parents, and he brought his whole crew, volunteered their time to be here this morning. So thanks to all of our volunteers who helped put this together. So to introduce our next speaker, I'd like to welcome Michael Pearson, who is the Director of the Washington County Department of Social Services. Michael.
Our next speaker, in the words of Ms. Sellars, has a superhighway brain. I just had to mention that. Dr. Jerry Yager. He has more than 30 years of experience in assessment and treatment of neglected, abused, and traumatized children. In his role at the Denver's Advocacy Center, he pursues his passion of educating professionals who work with children about the impact of abuse and neglect on the developing brain. He is a fellow under the mentorship of Dr. Bruce Perry. He graduated as doctorate in psychology from Nova University in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And you know, it's funny, as I was talking to Dr. Yager before this started, he gave me several freebies. And as the man started talking, I started jotting down notes because I thought, this guy's really fascinating. And one of the things that we were chatting about just earlier was about the delayed response that Child Protective Services and law enforcement officers may experience as secondary trauma. You know, many times we can hold it together in the short term, but 6 months later, those problems may begin to emerge. And so that was a freebie that I appreciate Dr. Yager sharing with me, and I hope that helps some of you. But without any further ado, can we give a warm Washington County welcome to Dr. Yager.
So, before I begin talking about what I want to talk, what I'd like you to do is at your table is our brains are taking in a lot of information, but we're like no other creature on the planet. We can decide on what kind of information we want to remember. So if you could just take 2 minutes and turn at your table and tell somebody, out of all the things you heard so far, what are 2 things you want to remember? Because by next week, you'll remember only about 5 things that you heard all day today, right? So if we intentionally attend our brain, actually we have the capacity by focusing our attention. So at your table, just take a moment to share with the person you're sitting with 2 things you want to remember so far before I give you new information. In terms of increasing arousal and increasing energy, right? Just looking out, I can see mouths moving and people smiling and doing it, right? So coming together and interacting, because of our brains, we've survived for hundreds of thousands of years as a social group, actually activates powerful neurochemicals and biochemicals in our body that allow us to be more productive. So this community of hope really is about accessing all this energy coming together that we can't do individually. Kind of look at that. So I'm going to talk a little bit. My task, they said, is you're going to have two great speakers come up before you, and your task is to tell people, so now what do you do with all that information? So I wanted to start by thinking about when Dr. Folletti was talking today, he began to create the opportunity for us to see problems from a different lens, from a different perspective. So for a long time, and actually still today, for many people, when they look at people who come to them with problems, they see them as having a weakness of character, or they're not motivated, or in some ways they're genetically inferior. And so when they have that way they're organizing, those beliefs drive what they think is the mechanism for what's going on. When you begin to form hypotheses about why somebody's doing, your understanding drives your behavioral response. So today, what we want to kind of accomplish is not necessarily that you'll remember everything, but you begin to have a different system of meaning for the clients and families and actually each other as you're interacting with them. And then Patsy came up and talked to you about a little bit about the mechanism, the neuroplasticity, that what we're exposed to with enough repetition actually changes the structure and functioning of our brain. So that when we begin to think differently, we begin to access different neural pathways that allow us to have new opportunities for interventions. And so understanding things in a different way, understanding the mechanism, allows us to say is, so now what do we do about that? So you have the beauty, because I've been doing this for a very long time. For a long time, I began to see things differently, but I didn't know what to do with them. Right? So in 1990s and 2000, when I read Dr. Folletti's, I said, that's really great. What the hell do you do with this stuff? Right? Or I went to see Dr. Perry talk. So we now are beginning to say is, we do know what to do about this. We do have ways to intervene. And so when we conceptualize things different, when we create different formulations, it should begin to drive new strategies, but then it's going to challenge the systems that we've created. Because in some ways, this whole model of having a separate child protection agency, and then if it's not a protection agency, you go over here and you have a mental health agency, or if somehow if you're a youth and you commit a crime, you're in a different. We understand really, what, based on Dr. Folletti's, is you can end up just by chance ending up at any one of those. And really, when you get to the root problem, it requires all of us coming to the table to try to help with that. So it's going to challenge us in terms of how these systems not necessarily stop doing what they're doing, but how we become increasingly more integrated. And we're better to do that than in school settings, where children show up every day and where they are being exposed to pattern repetitive activity constantly to be able to deliver some of these services. So that this brain of ours is a unique organ, because this brain isn't the same brain you're born with. It actually requires, it's waiting for experiences to wire. 70% of the brain is going to get wired after birth. And it's wired within the context of relationships. So this brain, even though it's a very small percentage of your total body weight, it's going to use about 25% of all of your biological resources. To be able to think is very metabolically costly. That's why when you're driving sometimes, and you realize I have no clue how I got to where I'm going, is our brain actually records information that we do over and over again in a very different part of this structure that allows us to do it without thinking. That allows us to do it automatically. That allows us, in some ways, to decrease the amount of metabolic, so that you can think about creating a shopping list, or you can think about those types of things. So that there is not enough resources to drive all the systems in the brain at the same time. So it's constantly making decisions about where to allocate those resources based on the demands in the environment. And so your brain has to be able, and your body has to be able to allocate resources when there's a demand out in the environment. But it also has to have a period of time in which it says, I'm going to stop and repair myself, I'm going to replenish myself, I'm going to move back to a state of well-being. And in a healthy system, there's an on switch that allows us to demand, and an off switch that allows us to repair. And what we know then is that when stress by itself is a really good thing. It allows us to access. So when I go to the gym and I lift weights, I'm stressing my body. I'm pushing my muscles to the extremes. But imagine if I kept lifting those weights and went past where I was tired. Would that be healthy for me? So the same activity that could be of health and well-being could also begin to create wear and tear on it. But I actually get no benefit from working out at the gym. When I get benefit is when I go home and I drink fluids and I start to relax and my muscles start to repair themselves, is when I get benefit from that exercise. So if we begin to think of this model, is that what we're asking some of our clients, some of our students sometimes, is to come in and learn new material, be able to respond to demands in the environment when they haven't had an opportunity to have repair, quiet, restoration. And then we're going to ask them to step up one more time again, to be able to do it. And so lots of our clients say is, I can't manage that anymore. I've got to find ways to find comfort, rest, and restitution. Right? So our biology is hundreds of thousands of years old. Mother Nature isn't like my wife, who when I get something new, she wants me to throw out something old. She goes in my closet to actually say, you got to throw out some clothes now. Right? Mother Nature says, I'm going to keep the same brain structures that we had when we were living in harsh, dangerous environments every day, but I'm going to put a supercomputer on top of it. So that lower brain structure doesn't have very many options. It responds automatically. And so when it gets triggered, it creates an alarm system. And that alarm system says to us is that I become a monster and I'm going to attack you. I'm going to get big and strong and puff up because I believe I can fight with you. Right? So this, even though this stance is really uncomfortable for us, this stance actually keeps me from becoming traumatized because I feel like I can actually move to action. The other stance is I get really scared and I run away. So if I'm faced with some type of danger and I can either fight with you or run away, I've been successful because tomorrow I can survive and do something better. But if I'm in situations that are overwhelming and make me feel powerless and helpless and I can't get out of it, then my biology says I need to start shutting things down. I need to start, in some ways, playing dead, because in nature, some animals don't like to eat dead things. So I'll play dead, hope that you'll go away. Now that works really well for reptiles because they can tolerate the slowing down in their heart, but it doesn't work well for us. It doesn't work really well for us. And so when we stay in these states for a prolonged amount of time, we begin to create changes in multiple systems. So that what we heard is that if you listen to the tapes, the little clips that Dr. Floody had, people's expectation of the world began to change. How they see the world was altered by their experience. Well, when the way they see the world changes, it begins to change their brain. And then, when their brain gets changed, it changes their relationships. Or it could start the other way. You have a really dysfunctional relationship, and it changes your brain, and based on your nervous system being changed, then I start to feel different in the world, and it changes the way I consciously think. So that all of these things become cumulative. And so you have a negative expectation of the world. I think it was the gentleman who said, I didn't think anybody would ever understand me. So he begins to see that. You begin to have this internal sense of shame. And shame is not about something you did, it's about who you are. You have intense negative emotional states, and when a child is growing up, they can't tell the difference between an emotional state and themselves. So when they feel bad, they are bad. They begin, their core beliefs about themselves get focused around that. And what we know then is the way we think about the world, just like I had you at your table start to talk to each other, and it changed your biochemistry. When I start thinking the world is a negative place and start behaving in the world as if it's a scary negative place, and I start believing people really knew me, or if I was skinnier, I would be vulnerable. Whenever I start to believe, it starts to create a different internal neurobiology. And that neurobiology begins to be both created by what happened inside, but also begins to change. So that what happened to me as a child isn't just what happened to me as a child, but it's this repetition of a negative feedback loop. Is that I then start to change my neurobiology, it impacts my relationships, it impacts the way I think, and I get stuck in this negative. So now I'm more vulnerable to being, just as we saw, I'm more vulnerable to doing drugs. I'm more vulnerable to all of these things that go on. But this is my way of taking care of myself. This is my solution to my nervous system not working well. Because I can't turn on my alarm system when I want, and I can't turn it off when I get away from the stressor. There's a woman, Dr. Rachel Yehuda, she works at Mount Sinai doing research, and what she said is, your catecholamines, which is adrenaline, get dissociated from cortisol. So cortisol stays high in your body, but you don't feel stressed anymore in the same way. And so you're beginning to have all of these negative biological impacts, but it's not necessarily associated with some threat in the environment. And so really, I could talk to you about, yes, I was abused as a child, and yes, that's why I do it, but it doesn't change how my nervous system responds. So just talking to people actually gives them an explanation, which actually helps, but their body still responds to threat unless we go in and do some help for them, right? Unless we create, in some ways, a different feedback loop, because these feedback loops, Dr. Coletti talked to you about, begin to change the way your DNA gets expressed. So that there's markers that actually go on top of your DNA. That's what epigenetics is. Epi being on top, genetics means your genes. And so there's markers that get placed on your genes that increase certain genes that get expressed. So for somebody who lives in a highly stressed environment, they're going to create way more receptors, say for cortisol, so they're going to become more sensitive to stress as opposed to somebody who's raised in a healthy environment. They're going to become, in some ways, and that doesn't mean they have more cortisol. They can actually, there's some research that have less cortisol in this, but their system is more reactive to it. So that based on their experience, so when we provide people certain experiences that are stressful, that are overwhelming, that are non-responsive, it starts to change them in negative ways. That's what we heard. It starts to increase their risk for heart disease. It starts to increase for mental illness. It starts to increase for a number of things, right? That's the bad news. But the good news is, if negative experiences can get those kind of outcomes, you as a community have to ask yourself, what are the positive experiences we want to provide to our children with enough repetition to get the positive outcomes? If we could change the body unintentionally by exposing them to all this trauma, as we labeled it, what are the type of experiences we need to provide to get positive outcomes? And that's where this field is going, to say there is hope, because we know now that I am not, my genes is not my destiny. I don't have to become what the last generation did. I have a vulnerability to become that way. But if I get exposed to certain experiences early in my life, I can begin to develop a different trajectory. So, this is a similar slide that Patsy showed you, is that you have some type of event that's perceived as traumatic, which means that it's not just the event, but it's my experience of that event and the impact of that event. And it goes on for a long period of time, that it begins to alter multiple biological systems. So when we ask, how does an experience become embodied in my physiology? it becomes embodied in my physiology by both my neuroplasticity, which means my brain is waiting for experiences to tell it how to wire itself up, but it's also becoming embedded through this epigenetic process that it's going to change the way my genes are expressed. And when you have a negative outcome, it puts it for high risk from many psychiatric disorders. And this work is being done by Martin Tesha at McLean Hospital in Boston. He's actually looking at is that there's some common neurological changes that go on in the brain that are common for all types of abuse. So, for example, you become much more sensitive to spotting danger in your environment. Wouldn't that make sense? If I was living in an environment where there were saber-toothed tigers, wouldn't I be really adaptive, to be really sensitive, to be looking out for them? But what if I was living in an environment, a community in which there's high levels of violence? Wouldn't it make sense that I became hypervigilant to potential danger in my environment? Would keep me safe in the community, might not be as adaptive coming to school, where I had to stop and pay attention to the teacher putting something on the board. So he also talked about that there's a thinning of the cortical structures that connect the two hemispheres. So that I experience something at an emotional level, but I have difficulty translating it over to some verbal narrative communication with myself. He talked about that the prefrontal cortex, which you talked about executive functioning, but it's responsible for self-regulation, self-awareness, self-monitoring, self-motivation. All of those self things that we talk about are managed by that prefrontal cortex that are down-regulated when exposed to high levels of stress without the buffering effect of a caring adult. So that we're getting these changes in our biology that are actually not conducive to being in school. But they are still adaptive to the environment I grew up in. If I had to somehow be really keen to read the facial expressions of my dad because he may be drunk today and tomorrow he's not, being hypervigilant, reacting, pretty adaptive. So that when we know these things, we begin to change the lens in which I see as like, wow, I honor the way that you figured out how to survive in such a scary environment. I honor the way that you were able to develop such creative solutions to unbelievable problems. However, the way you're bringing adult-child solutions to an adult world. The things you solved as a child worked for you really well. They're creating some problems for you as an adult. So, what usually happens is when we deal with individuals like this, they create feelings in us. How many moms do we have in the room? A lot of you out there, right? I want you to stop for a second and think about what it felt like when your baby cried. What did it feel like in your body? Anybody? Response? Anybody? What was the feeling? Not what you did, but what did it, created anxiety, worry, right? So a baby's cry is designed to activate your stress responses. It's like the fire alarm here. Imagine if the fire alarm went off and it played nursery rhymes. It wouldn't work very well because people, so the fire alarm is designed to irritate your nervous system. So when an infant cries, it's actually designed to create a similar biological state in their caregiver. The caregiver has to read their internal state, manage it, and then figure out a way to respond. And when they respond, and they respond appropriately and effectively, the infant starts to become regulated, and chemicals get released, reward chemicals, oxytocin, which causes bonding, actually biological opiates get released to calm their system. A similar state gets created in their caregiver. So that when there's this process of an infant getting dysregulated, stressed, communicating non-verbally through our mirrored neurons to the caregiver tolerates, modulates it, and then responds effectively. The infant gets regulated again. That infant begins, through that model, to begin to say, you know what? I'm amazing. I can just cry and I make things happen in my world. I begin to get a sense that I have some agency, that I am effective. Not only that is, when I cry, it's helpful for me engaging with another human being. It makes me feel good. And when that happens repetitively over and over again, the templates that Patsy talked about begin to get created, that being close to another person is helpful, but also that my core belief about myself is that I'm worthy and I'm capable. But when you're dealing with traumatized children, when they start to get dysregulated and they create an uncomfortable state in their caregiver or a teacher or a coach or whatever is in their adult, the adult says, I'm not doing something right, so I'm going to work harder to make that child do something. I'm going to make them read more. I'm going to make them practice sitting still. They work harder, the child gets more stressed, now starts to scream louder, creates a more distressing state in the adult. The adult says, this kid isn't doing what I want him to do and they're making me feel bad. So now I move from a social engagement interaction to one of defensiveness and say I'm either going to ignore this child and move away, or I'm going to use my power and control and say, you need to now go see the principal. And now I feel better because that child is out of my sight. That child has now effectively reenacted their early childhood experiences by creating an uncomfortable state in their caregiver or their teacher and engaging in a repetitive action that led to them distancing themselves or getting out of a situation. It did not serve to repair what went on. Right? And why does this happen? Well, we heard that the brain develops in a sequential way. Right? Well, the lower parts of this brain, they're really smart, but they function outside of our awareness and they function automatically. So, how many of you drive? Hands. Great. How many of you have ever had the experience of driving down the road and maybe listening to some music on the radio or kind of daydreaming, as Patsy said, or doing, right? And you're sitting there relaxing and a police car comes up behind you. How many of you at that moment feel served and protected? What happens, what's the feeling inside? Anxiety. What happens to your focus? Are you thinking about dinner, or are you thinking about, what happens to your focus? Right. So I start checking my speedometer. I use the blinker for the first time in my life to change lanes. Right? begin to get focused on the here and now and not thinking about the future and not thinking, is that was a biological response to what my body, not my cognition. I'm a good citizen, I know it. But Stephen Porges calls it neuroception, and it's an unconscious process of me scanning the environment and finding something that is perceived as dangerous and my body reacting much quicker than my brain. Now I have the cognitive ability to not step on the gas and get out of it. Right? But my body reacted. Now imagine you as a child care worker, you as a teacher, you as a foster parent. You are that police car driving up behind a child and their body reacts that way. You want to come there and say, I'm here to serve and protect you. But their body doesn't react in that way. And for them, their prefrontal cortex goes offline, and they don't have the ability to process information and do planning and look into the future and monitor that. And so many of the people we work with, they know consciously that they're not children anymore, and they probably are not in the same danger, but their body doesn't know that. They experience what's happening in the moment as a re-experience of what happened in the past. It's not, right? And so when we're working with people, I can't just tell you, you know what? You're not in danger anymore. Wouldn't that be great? We'd have drive-thrus, and you drive through, just like at McDonald's, and you come to my window and I say, don't worry, you're not in danger of being sexually abused anymore, and then you drive off. But it's not that easy because it's in their nervous system. Their nervous system was altered and that they react, and what we know is when our nervous system, when that alarm system goes off, we get dumber and dumber and dumber. So that if I imagine lots of you are somewhere between 100 and 120 IQ in here. But when you get stressed, when you have a deadline at work, you stop thinking about how to solve problems and you get very task-directed. And so your IQ drops enough for you to say, I'm just going to focus on that, right? So in Greece, the reason we have democracy is because they were surrounded by mountains. They had time to sit around and think about, oh, so I wonder if there's a different way to run governments, right? But when they're under attack, they can't do that. So you go and you start to do it, and then all of a sudden, you spill coffee on your lap, and you knock the coffee out, you just got a little dumber, and now you're all upset, you clean the coffee, and somebody comes to your office and says, I got this kid who's acting out, can you do something? It's like, just get out of here now, right? Because I'm now at a different, I'm not able to use my concept. So I'm pretty smart, I know this stuff, it happens to me all the time. I think Dan Siegel said we flip our legs. So when we're in this state, we are responding in the same way we did hundreds of thousands of years ago. That neural networks were built in to say is, I see you in my door asking for help as a saber-toothed tiger. And my body's going to respond that way. And so you think about working with parents. I know for me, like I had an adolescent, they'd come down screaming, and now I start screaming back at them. It's like you have two cognitively challenged people trying to solve a problem. Right? What do you think the solution to that? Is it to ask my 16-year-old daughter to organize herself in bed? Or is it to say is, like they do on the plane flying out here, if the oxygen comes down, adults, put your oxygen on first before you start to deal with it, right? And so we, as a community, if we want to solve really complex problems, we've got to put our oxygen on. We've got to get in the most creative, innovative, out-of-the-box part of our brain that allows us to think differently than our automatic, habitual way we've done it for years. We've got to begin to change, and we've got to begin to understand that our brain is so unique in that we can intentionally put our attention where we want it to be. We can direct our attention, and when I direct my attention, it begins to change my physiology. And now what they're learning is, if I get quiet, I have 80% of the fibers in my nerve fibers in my body, from my stomach to my heart to my lungs, are actually communicating information up to my brain about the state of my body, then I have to make a decision about how I want to respond. If I get quiet enough and attend to it enough. 80%. And so when people say I had a feeling in my gut, there's actually a physiological reason that you have that. But people who are traumatized lose the capacity to use internal signals that way. When their gut goes off, they see it as a potential threat, danger, and their alarm system reacts. And they begin to get defensive. When their heart starts to move, as Patsy's did when she got up here, it's potential danger. So they lose the capacity to utilize those internal signals, and they distort what's happening in their environment. So they begin to become really ineffective at being able to utilize the resources that are around them, both internally and externally. They require, just like that infant did, is that the people around them stay regulated and respond in a way that's helpful rather than the way that's escalating and is going to, in some ways, cause them to go further into a reaction. So when we look at this, right, we have to think about, I can't just ask you, even in doing EMDR, when I do EMDR, we don't start by saying, let's bring up the memory of you being sexually abused. Because that person doesn't have the internal resources to process it. Not to remember it. Some of them can remember it really well. But the reason they re-experience it is because they haven't integrated it yet. So my analogy is, it's kind of like I go to dinner and I eat an incredible steak, but tomorrow I may not digest that steak. So many of the people in those videos can tell you about what happened, but they have not digested those experiences and integrated those experiences. They relive them. And so we have to somehow begin to understand for our kids or our students or our clients that they experience arousal as a sign of danger. They are not goal directed. They don't have the ability to think in the future. So they're just like me at a time. I'm like right in the here and now. So if you ask them, which is an interesting thing, right? Because lots of them, if you ask them, they say, I don't really expect to live long. In my neighborhood, I'll be lucky if I live long. So what does that mean from a biological perspective if I'm not going to live long? It may mean I can take higher risks. It may mean I can do drugs and I don't worry about that, right? I can smoke, I don't worry. But it also may mean I've got to reproduce early, because I'm not going to be around as long, right? So when we look at issues like teen pregnancy and people living in high-risk environments, we start programs for teen pregnancy, but we don't think about what's the environment impacting them in their decision making. Right? So we begin to understand that, and that being in a fear state changes us. It changes the way you think it. It changes the way I perceive time. It changes the way I make decisions. It changes the way, my ability to be flexible. It changes us, and that many of our students begin to identify, or many of the clients, adults you're working with, they identify with those negative affect states. So I bet you if you got really into talking about some of those clients, patients that Dr. Folletti said, and you really got under it and you said to them, why do you think people are going to abuse you again? I would bet their core beliefs about themselves is, I'm really not worth it. And I'm really not capable of protecting myself, in other words. That their core beliefs are organized by those affect states. So that if we know that these negative affect states continue, it's not what happened to them as children, it's what's going to happen to them today that's going to continue, that's going to disrupt their relationships. We've got to think about a way to change it from a negative feedback loop to a positive feedback loop. We've got to decide today is, how do we interact with our students who have had these experiences? How do I interact with my adults who are going to come to me with negative expectations? How do I today start a positive feedback loop? What can I do to begin to change this for this person? We can't go back and change what happened to them. But we can change the interaction that happens right here, right now. That's the part that we can kind of look at. And we'll talk about the earlier, because of this great research, the earlier we get in starting these positive feedback loops, the easier it is to change the brain. The brain can change throughout our lifetime. But it's way more costly, and it takes way more repetition to change my brain than my 2-year-old grandson's brain. So our old model was, let's wait till you have really a lot of symptoms and I'll send you to Dr. Folletti to kind of help you work on it. Well, let's wait till you're really aggressive and out there and we'll send you to Dr. Yager and he can do some treatment with you. You know what? But I showed up in school and I was exhibiting these, you knew it when I was in school I was struggling with it. But you know what? That's just a school problem. We'll just let it go. We'll send it to the office. Sit them in a chair for a while, send them back. We know who these at-risk kids are in our community. We know who they are. So as a community, you have to ask yourself, do we want to wait till all those kids end up having major mental health problems, physical problems, be involved in the criminal justice system? Or do we want to say is, we want to create opportunities to intervene early? That's the question you're asking, and create some of these positive feedbacks. And the more comprehensive you are, the better. So instead of saying, you know what, this kid went to school, not doing well in school, you know what, it's the parents' fault. Why do we blame? It's an interesting thing. Why do we blame? Why are some things going on that's disturbing me? Do I find some comfort in blaming them?
Not me.
Not me. It's not my fault. It must be somebody else's. When I find myself blaming, it's usually because I have an internal uncomfortable feeling that I don't know how to manage. It's too much for me to manage, or I don't know how to, so I make it somebody else's fault. So I knock my coffee and I drop it. It must be my wife. She put something on the floor there. Right? I blame her. Right? Or I can't find my keys. It's like, who moved my keys? Right? Because I'm uncomfortable. So when we stop in this model of understanding it's not because anybody's doing anything wrong. It's because they've been exposed for a prolonged amount of time and found some solution. And that solution now is what we're seeing as a problem. What was it, an intermediate? What was the word you used, an intermediate? Necessary intermediate mechanism, which is a really nice way to say it, right? So we see that we could change the relationship now that the school has with the family. We could change the way the community wraps around the teachers. Instead of thinking, what are you teachers doing wrong with those kids at school? It's what do you need from us so you can do what you need to do in school. We begin to change this model to create a healthy relational milieu. As Dr. Perry calls it, a therapeutic web. We begin to change our relationships. Forget about your dysfunctional family. We begin to change the way we manage conflicts. We change the way we regulate our emotions. We change the way we handle our aggression. So if I'm really upset, I don't send an nasty email to you, but I talk to you about her, and that's like, that's violence. So we begin to say is, how do we as the adults in our community begin to manage all these difficult issues in a healthy way to model for people who are going to scan the environment and be sensitive to any potential danger. We have to step up to do things differently. So that when we're beginning to look at situations, we ask, what's going on inside of the person? Not what their behavior is. So I ask questions like, so what is their arousal level? Is it too high or too low? What is their affect? Is it uncomfortable or are they in a comfortable state? And so if it's too high, I've got to figure out some solution to help them lower it. And if it's too low, I've got to get them activated. And if they're in a really uncomfortable state, but I begin to think about how can I be of help to you as opposed to asking you just to manage yourself. Because if you could manage yourself, you would. If a kid could sit still in a seat and pay attention, they would. If a parent could come into you without yelling at you and blaming you, they would. So my assumption is you're doing the best you can, given the resources and your experience up to this point. How can I respond to you in a way that helps you develop those capacities? How can we begin to look at that, right? And what we have to do is assume that every child walking in that door, based on statistics, is going to have a high risk of being exposed to an adverse childhood experience. And a high percentage of them are going to have 3 or more. So that you put things in your schools, in your clinics, in your offices that are designed to say everybody who walks in my office or in my school has to come into a place that's going to communicate some sense of safety. And how do you do that? We're going to talk about that. But I start very clearly communicating that we are going to put efforts into creating a sense of safety in a place I'm asking you to learn. In a place I'm asking you to heal. In a place when I go to the doctor's office so that I can be in the best state to make use of the physical health care I'm getting. Is that we begin to kind of create environments and then we create some interventions where people need some extra support and kind of looking at some of those things. So let's talk a little bit about some of that. But before we do, I want to ask you to just reflect a little bit. You can share, you can not share, and I'm going to give you 2 minutes. But I want you to think about a kid, a mother, a family, a coworker that really made it difficult for you to for it because we automatically move in because hundreds of thousands of years we've had this brain that when something in the environment makes us uncomfortable, we record it, we document it, and we label it. But that's not the prefrontal cortex that we make decisions from. That's that automatic part of our brain. So if we're going to move to being trauma-informed instead of trauma-organized, we've got to stop individually or as a team to catch ourselves doing these things automatically and start saying, how do we get back to our prefrontal cortex and come up with some different hypothesis about why that can happen. And so to build on this, we need to begin to engage with children and families, and when there's a disruption, to repair them. Ed Tronick from Boston does micro analysis of mother-infant interactions, and he said that a good parent is only attuned to their child 30% of the time. 30% of the time. How many of you think you could do that with your kids 30% of the time? 30% is not a lot, right? But a good parent repairs it or tries 100% of the time. You don't have to get this right, but you have to work to repair these relationships when they get disrupted. We have to help people feel safe enough to deal with vulnerable feelings. We can't just ask people to come in our office and expose the vulnerable part for them when their experience is being vulnerable has been dangerous. So we have to build that. We have to teach kids. So I take that slide I showed you and I teach kids about their alarm system. I actually begin to help them understand that when they get really angry, it's perfectly, their body's working perfectly well, except their brain's shut off, the top part of their brain, right? So I don't try to talk to them at that point. I wait till they settle down and we kind of process. So I also teach them things like attention, things like paying attention to relevant information in your environment is a learned skill. It's a learned skill. Orientating to things like, you know what, if you slap your hands in a room with an infant, they'll turn towards the sound. You don't have to learn to attend to things that way. But paying attention is a learned skill. So many of the kids that we're looking at and giving them Ritalin because they're hyperactive and they have attention disorders are really traumatized people who are scanning and can't manage regulating their bodies and kind of looking at that. We have to increase their capacity to be reflective and aware, and we have to increase their sense of efficacy. So how do we do that? Is we begin to pay attention to what's going on in their body and teach them to pay attention to what happens. We begin to give them words to describe what they're feeling, and then help them identify feelings. And what I do with kids is I start by, when we go out and play basketball and doing it, I stop just like I did and say to you, what's it feel like after you run around playing basketball? How do you feel? I feel really good. How do you know your body? Where do you feel that in your body? I begin to get them to become much more aware, but start with positive experiences for them as opposed to negative. Because traumatized people spend a great deal of time paying attention to really uncomfortable things inside them. I don't remember who it was, but I went to a conference and somebody described it as, I don't want to, going inside, it's kind of like visiting a neighborhood you don't want to be alone in. Being inside, so I don't ask them to go inside and look at negative things. I start by building on positive things. I start to help them understand that when they get stressed, they stop having the ability to learn, to play, to explore, and they start finding ways to protect themselves. So gaining weight is a protection. Smoking is a protection. Eating, having sex is a protection. but they lose the capacity to have healthy relationships and manage it. So I asked them, is that something you'd want? And they begin to say, yes, it's one. And I say, then we've got to help you in some ways find windows of time to let down and experience some of that. And I invite them to do it, as opposed to telling them to do it. I give them an invitation for some of these things. So, what do we know about this? So, Patsy talked about regulation. But when I'm regulated, not only am I physically safe, but I have an internal sense that I am safe. I can manage what comes up in my body. I can manage, so I'm safe with what I'm feeling. And then once I'm safe, I've got to feel connected. So now, when I'm connected, when you invite me, when I come home from the weekend and I miss a day of school and you come back and say, I missed you yesterday, where were you? I feel like I belong here and I'm worthy. So now I begin to feel connected and worthy. If you look at this, if you flip this around, this is Maslow's hierarchy. Right? So now once I'm worthy and I can do it, now I need you to teach me skills and competencies to be successful. But if you start teaching me skills and competency to be successful when I'm unsafe, I see it as intrusive and overwhelming. So, what do you need to do? And what do we need to do? We need to become more mindful and self-aware ourselves. We need to be aware of intentionally why we're doing things or not doing things. So I'm always asking, why aren't people paying attention? Why isn't the medical field paying attention to Dr. Coletti's research? What does it create? What's the threat in them? Right? Or why am I'm bringing in a new way of teaching something, but people are telling me they don't want to change? Why are they feeling threatened by this? And how do I help them feel safer to be able to make that change? If I go to them and say, hey, you know what? What you're doing just doesn't work, and it doesn't work anymore. I'm doing to my colleagues what we're telling us not to do to our kids. So we have to create an environment that is actually open for change. Google, a company that thought for a very long time that survival depended on productivity, now realizes its survival depends on innovation and creation. They create an environment that's ideal for them. We have to learn from them about how to run our schools and how to run our organizations. We have to become, in some ways, create relational milieus where people can access resources. So when you come here today, would it be nice if you could call somebody who was an expert with adults and you were a kid and said, I have this parent? We have to create learning networks. I have a phone in my pocket. I can get Siri to answer just about any question I want. Right? We have access to an unbelievable amount of information. But in order to do that, we have to be able to be really aware of our nonverbal cues. I've got to be aware of my facial expression. I've got to be aware of my tone of my voice. I've got to be aware of the way I stand, the way I respond, because much more information gets communicated non-verbally than verbally. So when we're talking about being welcoming, we really have to take a look at some of those things and kind of look at some of that. I've got to create classrooms that are designed for regulation and for safety and custodial. I'm going to get through this because I want to get through a slide. For the most part, we've got to shift from a traditional model that consequences people and rewards people to saying the most rewarding experience people have is being connected to somebody who truly cares about me and the way I am in the world. And so we have to create models of regulation. We have to create early intervention. So if I know you're going to get disrupted in 10 minutes, I'm going to intervene in 5 minutes. I'm going to create, as opposed to worrying about am I reinforcing negative behaviors. So I begin to change, and you'll have access to these slides to kind of look at that. Because I want to kind of get to this last slide before I end, and then I want to do one more exercise with you. But if we know this about the brain, if we have Dr. Folletti's work, Dr. Bruce Perry's work, Vanderkolt's work, if we know that the brain is being organized and that a 2-year-old has twice as many neural connections as an adult, waiting for experiences to start pruning it down and prioritizing certain systems over another, if we wait to put resources later on in their life, we miss a great opportunity. And we're ineffective, and it's very frustrating because we develop a sense of hopelessness, and then we start blaming. So we have to find a way that this brain develops at an incredibly explosive rate from in the womb to about 4 years old, and then continues to grow through adolescence. We have to provide pattern repetitive experiences to optimize people's opportunities for health, well-being, and relationship. Because when we're connected, there's much less of a chance that you're going to come and rob me. You're going to blow up my school. You're going to... All the things we fear that we want to create programs, the greatest program is being connected socially to each other, to kind of looking at that. And I want to end, and then we'll kind of ask you questions, because I know Keith will start getting anxious if I don't end. But I want to take a moment. I'm a Bronco fan. So this year I felt very connected, right? Down here. But for me, football is a really important part of my life, so I want to share something. When my team scores a touchdown, who gets the credit? Who does the announcers pay attention to? The receiver, quarterback, maybe the running back. But what touchdown ever got scored on the field without the offensive line doing their job? When does the offensive line get recognized? When they cause a penalty, they throw a flag and they publicly humiliate them. Right? You guys are the offensive line of the community. You guys are the people that are stepping up. I'm actually talking to you about getting involved. You are the offensive line. But unless you take time to recognize each other and the work that you do, the rest of the community is not going to come along and do that for you. They're going to throw a flag when you do something wrong. And so before you leave here today, I really would like you to take a moment as you're leaving here, is to thank the people that are sitting next to you in the next table, because in a society that values themselves on the accumulation of wealth and power and success, you have stepped up for the welfare of others. And the fact you show up each and every day says something about you. And that if we can start to create the relational environment where we thank each other, we don't just get in the room and start talking about what do we do with that family and what do we do. We thank each other for showing up, and we take a moment to recognize what an incredible opportunity is to work with such dedicated, committed, caring individuals and a whole room for them. So I want to thank you personally for what you do. And I know I want to thank you from the rest of the presenters here. But you guys are the people who make touchdowns possible. So take a moment and recognize yourselves.
All right, for a few questions, and then we're going to start to wrap up after that. Who would like to ask Dr. Yager some questions?